When I left off in the previous video, a handkerchief was floating through the air over an idyllic cityscape where fancy buildings are interspersed with luscious park reserves and light novel guy makes a nice catch. A quick shot of light novel girl informs us that the handkerchief is hers and she seems to be upset about something. Now if you're a genre-savvy anime watcher viewing this episode for the first time, then you probably already know what's about to happen. All you had to see was that the girl's shirt isn't buttoned up all the way, and you can guess that this scene is going to end in light novel guy accidentally seeing her in her underwear as a result of his nice guy attempt to return her handkerchief. If you're like me, then you're probably halfway between rolling your eyes and being quietly impressed at the speed with which this show is rushing headlong into trashiness, but we'll put a pin in that for now. We get our first good look at light novel guy and oh my god, it's Kirito! No wait. It's Inaho? It's hard to tell with these A1 Pictures characters because they all have the same fucking face. Seriously, there's like maybe 10 or so different face templates which this studio seems to use on every single character in the majority of their shows. It's crazy. Now look, I'm not one of those guys who thinks that anime characters all look the same. I can appreciate the subtle differences between, say, the characters in K-On! Versus the characters in Hyoka versus the characters in Hibike Euphonium. And I've seen evidence to the fact that when you switch these characters' faces around, they actually look really weird. But what happens when you put Kirito's face on Ayato? Oh. Or what about Inaho's face? Oh. I guess anime characters do all look the same. And it's funny that I'm even bringing this up right now because it is so much worse with their girl characters. Anyways, I digress. Light novel guy, by the way, this guy's name is Ayato, gets all glowy, meaning he's gonna do some superpower stuff, and makes this really awful looking leap up to light novel girl's window. He lands all dainty and smooth, but then is struck with embarrassment as he realizes what he's just accidentally done. Pat yourself on the back, everyone, because you saw this coming. Funnily enough, our first panty shot is decidedly not tantalizing on account of light novel girl apparently has no ass whatsoever, but the camera pans up quickly to hide it and to get into some bra territory. We will come back to this in a second, after the camera's done panning out across the entire world of the story, in a way that actually kind of reminds me of the opening panning shot from Kill La Kill, besides being several fathoms less interesting because it's just a normal city and not the creatively constructed world of Honnouji Academy. This comparison may end up being more relevant than you first expect, but we'll save that for later. After the title card, we fade in on this shot of a huge building complex, which at this point I'm going to assume is a school campus, in which case it may indeed roughly share the populace of a small city. The main building is 28 stories high, I counted. So of course it wasn't enough that we caught a glimpse of this girl in her underwear before, now we get the full-on slow camera pan treatment with all of the details in the garments. May I remind you that this is our first exposure to this character, forgive the double entendre. Before we've been treated to any piece of information about her whatsoever, our first impression is that her underwear matches her hair. Now look, I'm not someone who dislikes fan service in general. In fact, I actually enjoy shows like Kanokon and Seikon no Quasar, wherein the fan service is pretty much the entire point of the show, because at that point it's basically just softcore porn with actual characters. Even in shows that aren't about fan service, I tend to be okay with it as long as the fan service is what I call diegetic. What I mean by this is that the characters are scantily clad for reasons that actually seem normal and make sense narratively. Like, it's not unusual to think that if you, say, went to the beach with a bunch of girls, then you're going to see them in sexy bathing suits. That kind of thing is a part of life. It can even add to characterization or to our perspective on a character to see how they may act in situations that lead them to be naked or sexualized, and that is totally normal and makes sense. What bothers me is when you take like a plot-driven show that doesn't really have much to do with sex or sexuality, and then you cram in a bunch of random, totally unrealistic scenes wherein characters accidentally see one another naked just for the sake of itself. I mean, it's not like I don't understand the appeal of having like a real, normal, plot-based show that happens to be full of cute girls and maybe sometimes you get to see them naked. But it's not even slightly difficult to accomplish this just by having the girls like converse in a locker room, or make a pool episode, or at the very least, just admit that the guy is deliberately checking the girl out. A moment like this doesn't even feel like it's happening in the context of the story. It feels like it's happening directly to the viewer. Like the universe of the story has conspired around finding a situation in which the audience can be treated to a titillating camera pan of a half-naked girl, which isn't really in character from the main guy's perspective, nor a logical result of the narrative at all. And what's more, in this particular case, I'm not even really sure how this is meant to attract me to the show. Light novel girl certainly isn't my type, which is more a matter of personal taste, but why do I even care that I caught a 2-second glimpse of some girl I've never even seen before in her underwear? If I wanted to, I could minimize this window right now, open up a new tab, and type pink hair anime boob into Google and immediately have hundreds of pictures of girls identical to this one in whatever state of undress most interests me for as long as I want. What is so enticing about random disjointed fanservice moments that it could possibly compete with the infinite resource of carnal pleasures known as the internet? But for the sake of argument, let's say that I live in a universe where the only source of entertainment in existence is anime, and my browser has been set to automatically load up Crunchyroll at all times and no other websites whatsoever. I'm still only a few clicks away from Kanokon, Recently My Sister is Unusual, Demon King Daimao, and So I Can't Play H, which all have a lot more fan service with actual nudity and better animation. If I'm specifically only into girls with long pink hair, I've got Shin Koihime Muso, R15, and Familiar of Zero right there. If I'm specifically interested in seeing fan service of a character voiced by Ai Kakuma, then I can watch Amagi Brilliant Park and Kanojo ga Flag Oraretara on the same site. The only thing that this scene provides me, which I can't get a better version of elsewhere, is fan service of a pink-haired girl voiced by Ai Kakuma. And if you're watching this show for such a specific reason, then you probably don't really give a shit about whether it's good or not. By the way, if you want to watch all of those shows, why not use my Crunchyroll link to sign up and make me some money? So Light Novel Girl reacts about how you'd expect, and we watch her change into her weird illogical school uniform as Kirito explains his reason for being there. As soon as Light Novel Girl hears this, she makes the fastest transition from Tsun to Dere that I think I've ever seen, lowering Inaho's guard and making her look like kind of a reasonable person. On a side note, it sure was considerate of the school to provide their students with uniforms that conform perfectly to the contours of their ass. I bet that's real comfortable. Of course, the idea that Light Novel Girl is actually a reasonable character is nothing but a false promise, and as soon as she remembers her purpose in the story, she immediately flips into attack mode and destroys her own living quarters. Like, what else is this shot meant to communicate if not that she has literally blown up her entire apartment because some guy to whom apparently she is incredibly grateful happened to see her in her underwear for a second? It's a good thing this show takes place in a world where everyone's moral principles are different from ours, or else this behavior would seem completely irrational. Now, you've probably figured out at this point that I'm not going to offer this show a whole lot of compliments. That's not what any of us are here for anyways. But while we're on this shot of Light Novel Girl's cocky smile, I'd like to give it credit for the one thing that I do think was handled alright by this show. The color design. I realize that some of my critics, who literally refer to me as Pretty Colors Digibro, are laughing their asses off right now, but seriously, the colors are pretty. As silly as the uniforms are, they kind of remind me of Phantasy Star Online, and as much as I don't like Light Novel Girl's hairstyle, I like that shade of pink and how it contrasts with her eyes. The use of gradients in her hair is nice and subtle, which isn't going to be the case for every character, but we can talk about that later. I just wanted to pause on this shot because it's actually got some character to it, even if that character has been such a jumbled mess over the past 30 seconds that it's impossible to have any idea what this girl is actually like. The next shot immediately caused me to burst out laughing. At first I thought, Jesus Christ, that is some awful framing. Who would ever position the camera like that? The characters look like they're just superimposed onto the background, and then I saw the CG classmates. Nothing quite takes me out of a scene the way a bunch of random generic CG pedestrians do. It's never enough that they look completely different from everything else in the show's world and stand out like a sore thumb, but they always end up with these janky walk cycles that look fucking hilarious. This shot is especially incredible because the perspective is so fucked up that they look like they're significantly shorter than the main characters. After a couple more students filter into the foreground, it becomes apparent why the main characters look so awkwardly superimposed onto the background. The trees in the distance have this awful filter drawn over them to make them look washed out, as do the CG classmates, and the students in the foreground are blurry and out of focus, which is meant to suggest that the focal point of the proverbial camera is fixed on the main characters. However, the entire grassy area that they're standing on is all in focus, especially the foreground closer to where the students are standing. This is yet another case where it seems like they tried to pull off something cool and cinematic, but only went halfway and ended up with something janky and hideous. We're treated to a quick rinse and repeat of the girl being irrational and then standing awkwardly in a shot full of CG dudes, and then we finally learn her name. Yulis. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. She presses this button on her boob and then a super weird laser thing shoots out of it and a duel is begun. I'm not going to comment on the other details here because they'll kind of be more relevant later. Believe me, you're not missing anything. They just kind of stand there and talk about how they're gonna fight for like a minute and a half while the camera tries its damnedest to find new angles to shoot them from. After some random weird little sci-fi holograms float around for a while, we finally launch into yet another big, stupid, pointless fight. Only this time it goes on for 2 whole minutes. I mean, it's better than last time since we at least know that both of these characters are relevant and we know their names and why they're fighting, but somehow knowing that this entire fight is predicated on a stupid-ass accidental pervert scene and that there is literally nothing at stake somehow makes it all the more annoying. The only conceivable narrative purpose for this fight would be to show off the powers of the main characters, but like everything else in this show, the powers are generic and meaningless. Yulis has a bunch of terrible looking fire spears that she throws at Kirito and he blocks them all easily. Then she uses the same attack at a higher speed and the result is basically the same. The constantly changing camera perspective, ultra brief cuts, and random explosions all create a nauseatingly difficult to comprehend scene that looks like a million things are going on even though barely anything is actually happening. Yulis is impressed with Kirito's speed, so she decides to hit him with a stronger attack. All of her attacks have stupidly long and complex names that you will never ever remember if they come up again, but that's okay because the attack is just a really big fuck off fireball. Kirito runs straight at the fireball, but it's a trap. Yulis actually makes it explode. Now, in the process of making this video, I have watched this fight scene 4 times, and it wasn't until the 4th time that I really sat back and thought about what happens next. Every other time, I was so bored and disoriented by all the flashing lights that I just kind of stopped thinking about it until the fight was over. But now that I'm going through this moment by moment, I can really allow myself to drink this in. Inaho jumps directly through the explosion as if it didn't do anything to him at all, while shouting the name of an attack called like the Twin Dragon or whatever, and then cuts the explosion, I think? Is that what's happening here? Like, it's clear that the explosion has already happened. He is inside of the explosion, and it has not done anything to affect him, but then he slashes his sword in the air a couple of times, and there seems to be another explosion behind him as a result, or something? What the fuck is going on in this shot? Right from this, we cut to Kirito pushing Yulis to the ground to protect her from a yellow energy bolt thing fired from the sideline, so whatever the fuck was going on with him inside of that explosion is just kind of written off in the next shot. I'm willing to bet that no one even noticed how utterly and weirdly stupid that fight scene actually was. So many things were moving around so quickly and there was so much visual stimulation that the entire thing just kinda turned into white noise. And it's not until that moment when Ayato pushes Yulis to the ground that you wake up from your trance and realize that the episode is still happening. Considering that all of those enormous explosions didn't even manage to scorch the grass in the place where the characters were just fighting, you could be forgiven for mistaking that entire scene for a fever dream that you had after passing out during the prior 2 minutes of characters standing around. It was right around this point, in my first viewing of this episode back when it came out, that I stopped watching the show. After 7 minutes of nothing but irritating, generic, and boring scenes, this utterly meaningless action sequence finally lost me to the point that I got out my phone and started tweeting about how shitty and boring the show is, and I think I left it running for like 3 more minutes before I finally shut it off. At this point, you probably have a pretty solid general sense of what goes through my head when I'm watching a show like this. The kind of relentless scrutiny that builds up and breaks a show for me so quickly that I just can't take it anymore. But, my dear viewers, if you'll have me, then this is not the end. I did not make this video to explain why I dropped the Asterisk War. I made it so that I can slowly try to get to the heart of all the things that bother me so much about shows of this nature and about the works of Studio A1 Pictures. In pursuit of this, I have already watched all of the 7 episodes of the Asterisk War which have aired at the time of this writing, and believe me, I have a lot more to talk about, so stick around on my channel if you want to see more. Continued in part 3.